Chapter 16. Just Doing. "Did you visit me in my room last night, or was that only a dream?" he blurted out as soon as his parents had walked out the door. "Both," Cornelia answered with a smile. David was left speechless. "I wondered if I could visit you the same as I visited grandfather, but you felt so scared that I left before I said anything." David felt numb, but also relieved. The question that he had been bursting with at the breakfast table was answered so simply by his little sister, and it felt so good just to be able to converse freely without having to consider someone else's safeguards. "I want to learn how to do that. Can you teach me?" he asked. "I don't know. I just started doing it myself, and I don't really know how I do it. It just seems to happen. But I do know that I really wanted to meet grandfather that first time that it did. But grandfather had really come to see you. It was just that he came to the wrong room. So maybe if you had been in your old room, you would have met him at that time in your own dream instead of me." "But you did come to my room last night in my own dream? Were you dreaming as well, or did you really come in? And I really didn't know if I was awake or asleep." "Yes, that's the way it was when grandfather first visited me. I didn't know if I was awake or asleep. But last night when I went to visit, I really was interested to know if I could visit you in a dream. So maybe really being interested is the preparation." "Yes," answered David, "and maybe last night I got preoccupied with whether I was awake or dreaming, rather than just being present with you when you visited." "You may be right. When grandfather appeared in my room, I was so excited to meet him that it didn't matter if it was a dream or not. And when I visited him, I was excited about seeing him again. So other questions didn't get in the way. I wonder if questioning and doubting get in the way of knowing," Cornelia suddenly reflected. David realized what a keen, intuitive mind she had, and that knowing was more important to her than how she knew. Yes, maybe needing to know how gets in the way of knowing. Riding a bicycle is the way I learned to ride, and there's no way I could have known how without doing it. So maybe visiting in a dream is my new bicycle, and I just need to do it without first having to know how. David felt relieved, like he had resolved an old stumbling block. Maybe thinking that he first needed to know how got in the way of actually doing. But wasn't this exactly what Bearman had been teaching him in the village? To just trust being in a situation, and that his doing was itself the learning. And wasn't this exactly the source of the cages that mother and father had built? Their knowing really got in the way of just being present. Chapter 17. Teacher Cornelia. David felt greatly relieved following the realization he had just had. It was so simple, and yet so profound. His mind had been jumbled up with thinking. He thought he needed to know before doing, and he really just needed to do and to learn from the doing itself. Doing itself was the teacher. He realized he had been getting in the way of his teachers all his life. In fact, his parents had been also, and so had his teachers at school. Only Bearman and grandfather and the people in the village did not let thinking get in their own way. Not that they didn't think, but that they trusted their doing without having first to think about what they would do, or to think they first needed to know how before they tried something. But this is what he had done in the village. Why was he different now that he was home? Now he understood that was one of the things that was so different about Cornelia. She trusted her doing and didn't need to think something through before she did it. That's why she was so fresh and enjoyable to be with. She was always directly present in her relationship with David. Her thinking did not get in the way. She could think, and she could think deeply and beautifully, but she did not need to think first. What if thinking was something that was supposed to come after doing rather than before? He suddenly realized that is the way that thinking had come to encage doing, by insisting on being first. And wasn't this also what he had been being taught at his school up until the time that Grandfather had rescued him? And was this why Grandfather had insisted that it was time for him to come home again, so that he could see how easy it was to revert to the situation, to once again become automatic in the place where that was expected of him? Was this also one of Grandfather and Bearman's lessons, to put him in this situation so that he could learn directly from what he did in this situation? He realized what excellent teachers they were. They didn't try to teach him by telling him, but trusted that he would learn from his own doing and his own awareness by just being in the situation itself. David also understood why Cornelia was such an excellent teacher for him. Chapter 18, Experiencing. With this realization, David was pacified. He could relax now. His mind was no longer a jumble with the desperate need to understand. He breathed deeply now and easily, and breathing seemed to be what he had not been doing, at least not easily. He recognized that his breath had been hard and fast and forced, and the thought came to him, was breathing like his mind, like a mirror of his mind? But then another thought entered. What exactly was understanding? What does understanding mean? What happened when he understood something? And why would his breathing be involved? Was it breathing that understood? Or was it his thinking? Or was it something deeper? Perhaps something even deeper than himself. But that didn't make any sense. But what does sense mean? David realized that he was getting all caught up in words, and that perhaps understanding was something deeper than words. He realized that when he understood something, he felt at home in a situation, that somehow he fit in a way, or that the situation fit himself. It was like putting on clothes that felt comfortable, as opposed to putting on clothes that didn't fit. But he also knew that it was not about clothing, but about something more like a story. Like the story made sense. The story fit, or perhaps he himself fit into the story in some way. And he suddenly realized that in dreaming and needing to know, there was a story that he had been telling himself, and that Cornelia was telling him things that did not fit into the story that he already knew. Then it struck him. He needed to begin telling himself a story about dreaming that was larger than the story he had been telling himself all his life. A new story where there was room to act within a dream, even though he did not know how to do that. And then something opened up within him that was like a zipper opening a jacket that had been too tight. If the story he told was smaller than his experience, he needed to tell a larger story. It was as simple as that. And he knew he had been seeing it all his life. He had constantly been confronted with that when he was with Grandfather and Bearman. And he also saw the cages that his parents were caught in. Their story was too small to allow for more experience, and so they excluded new experiences in order to continue to tell the same old story. They limited their experiencing to the story they already told, and he had been doing the same thing now without fully realizing it. A lack of understanding meant that the story he told himself needed to grow bigger. He saw that he had been trying to juggle the old story in order to fit new experiences. But people were in charge of stories, and especially of the stories that they themselves told. The need to tell a consistent story was limiting their ability to take in new experiences. David had just realized that experiences needed to be the determining limit rather than stories. But did people have an innate need for consistent stories, or was it something that each person learned? And wasn't this exactly the difficulty that he had had with the school he had been attending in this small town? The school was based on stories rather than on experiences. And Grandfather and Bearman, and now Cornelia, had all shown him that their own stories grew to encompass the experience. Their stories were flexible and alive. Mother and Father told stories that excluded experiences, and so they were as dead as a repeated story that is too small for aliveness. Chapter 19. Profoundly Present. Are you ready? David was startled almost out of his skin to hear Cornelia's voice. He had thought he was alone in his room, although he realized he had been in deep thought. He looked at her and prepared to answer her when he saw that she held her finger to her lips. Why does she want me to be quiet? Is someone here? He thought to himself. Cornelia quietly took David's hand and led him to the door and opened it. They both stepped through. David was still wondering what was going on when he felt like he had been struck by lightning. They were in the large room of the long house, and Grandfather was standing in the middle of the room. Grandfather quietly invited them to sit down. "You think too much. That is why I wanted you to go home for a while. Now you're being startled out of your thinking. That's good. And I'm so happy to have met your little sister. She is little and young, only 5 years old, but in her awareness she is a giant, and she is ancient. You can learn much from her." David suddenly realized that his own thinking had been brought to a standstill, and it felt good. The struggle was over. He greeted Grandfather with deeper thanks than he had ever felt before, and now he really knew what it was to be profoundly present. Chapter 20. A Cup of Tea. "Let's have a cup of tea," Grandfather said. David saw that the pot of water was already boiling, and Grandfather took some fresh herbs and put them in the pot. He brought out a small cup for each of them, and when the herbs had steeped enough, he poured a cup for each of them. First Cornelia, then David, and last of all for himself. David held the cup in both hands as it had no handle, and in fact it was more like a small bowl. "Now that you know you can travel in your dreams, we can meet more often, and you won't have to wait for me to arrive in my beetle," Grandfather said to David, with a smile on his lips. "Why didn't you come to me through a dream the first time you came?" David asked. "Because we needed to bring your body here as well as your awareness. Your body and your awareness needed to wake up together, and that was Bearman's job. Once they were together, then you could begin to learn that they could also be deliberately separate, as they are now. Eventually, some very wise people can learn to bring their body along after their awareness has traveled, but that usually requires very deep experience that only very old people have had the time to develop. Right now it's important that you learn the flexibility of your awareness and how to go with it to places where it's needed or to where it needs to go." "But if my body is back at home and my awareness is here, then where am I?" asked David with concern. "Ah," said Grandfather, "you are your identity, and that began to loosen while you were here with us. But you needed to go back to where that identity first began in order to loosen it fully. Eventually it will learn that it was never supposed to be in charge. It really developed for the sake of other human beings, and it was mainly useful in situations where you needed to survive among other humans who were deeply stuck in their own identities. An animal or a tree or a mountain or the sea needs no identity. It is just who it is, and it does what it does. And it doesn't have to account for itself to others, as humans have learned to do. And a craziness has developed among some humans where they think that their identity is more valuable than their awareness. And they spend their entire lives developing an identity rather than loving their aliveness. Aliveness and existence are the true gifts that the great universe has given us. David saw Cornelia nod in agreement. She seemed to be hearing something that she already knew. But for David, this was something quite important that he had never fully realized before. Grandfather saw the opening in David, so he continued. For some cultures, identity begins with being given a name. A name is first of all just a sound, but some sounds have a long history. That sound becomes the thing that is made when our attention is desired by someone else, and we quickly learn to focus our attention in the direction from which the sound comes. After a while, we begin to make that sound ourselves, and then we think that we are the sound. But a sound is just a sound. In cultures that have remained more in relation to the earth and to nature, a child discovers the name that belongs to him. So his identity begins with his own discovery of himself, through his experience. Bear Man, for example, got his name because as a child he wandered fearlessly into the mountain, and a mother bear who had lost a cub began to care for him. He was gone for days, and everyone wondered where he was. But we could feel that he was all right. He finally wandered back into the village, fat and happy, but with the smell of bear on him. And he told us that he had found his bear mother in the mountain. She had loved and fed him like a cub, and he returns to her whenever he wishes. That must be who I met on the mountain. I wondered why Bear Man wasn't afraid of it. Bear Man has little fear, except where needed. He has always been that way. Some people carry around old fears that they have packaged, but not Bear Man. But let me say a little more about identity now that you have asked, added Grandfather with a soft smile. The most difficult aspect of identity is that people band together based on identity. And in this mood, they lose sight of the fact that we all share this earth, this universe. No one owns it. No one has the right to restrict another from it, and no one has any right at all to injure anything that exists. We may add to it, we may require aspects of it, but similarly, something is also required of us. David didn't understand what Grandfather was talking about, but he knew from previous talks with Grandfather that it usually made sense along the way. He had only to wait and to invite his awareness. When people gather around a presumed identity, they can turn dangerous without the ability to turn back, like a river that is raging. When they form an identity to which they can mutually belong, then they lose perspective of their individual wholeness, and the mass of their power can turn destructive, especially if they presume that they are threatened. But many people have already abandoned their wholeness, and so the presumed identity gives them a sense of belonging to something greater. If they had retained their wholeness, they would know that they always belong to the greater whole, to that which we call the great universe. What is the great universe? Cornelia asked, and David realized that Grandfather had been talking to her as well. The great universe is the largest wholeness that exists, and you have always been a part of it, and have always belonged to it and in it, Grandfather replied. It knows you're here because it has sent you here, and it is important that you recognize this in everything you do. You may not know why you're here, but that is a part of the great mystery, and that is a knowing that your own mind may not have access to, but the wholeness of your being does, in everything that it does. Cornelia nodded, and David realized that she was closer to what Grandfather was talking about than he was. But he also recognized that he was trying to know with his mind, rather than with the wholeness of his being. Chapter 21. Attack. I can't listen to another word, David thought to himself. My mind is so jumbled now that I feel like I'll explode if I sit here for 1 second more. At that very moment, Cornelia grabbed David by the hand and yanked him so hard he thought he would fall over and hit his head on the floor. He shut his eyes tight, anticipating the blow, and he was almost as shocked when instead he felt a cool wind blowing in his face. "What's happening?" David opened his eyes to discover that he was flying through the air at a tremendous speed. Glancing around in surprise, he saw that he was high in the air, and that Cornelia was by his side, and that they were both birds. Cornelia swooped downward in a large circle and landed next to a lake. David followed close behind, and he was shocked to see another bird flying toward him. The bird looked like it was trying to collide with David, and David knew this would be a deadly fight. He spontaneously swung his feet forward and extended his claws, fully prepared to do battle with the attacking bird. At the last minute, just before they both collided, he saw that the attacker had 3 red stripes on each side of his beak. And then they slammed into each other with a loud splash. David was shocked to find himself underwater, and there was no sign of the attacker. He swam to the surface and saw Cornelia sitting on the bank of the lake, laughing and laughing. As he climbed out of the water, he realized that the attacking bird had been his own reflection mirrored in the clear lake. Stunned and dripping, he crawled over and sat beside Cornelia. She put her head on his arm and said, "That was the funniest performance I have ever seen." Chapter 22. A New Freedom. David awoke in his bed. It was early morning. He didn't know if this had just been a dream, or if he had really been dream traveling with Cornelia. He must ask her. But it was still dark, and he didn't even remember going to bed. Could this be just another dream? No. He stood up and walked a few steps. He could feel the floor firmly under his bare feet. He breathed deeply. That felt good. He realized that he felt not just good, but great. And he was deeply happy. He knew that Cornelia had come to teach him dream traveling, and he had also had a lovely visit with Grandfather. How perfect that he could now visit Grandfather in his dreams, and that perhaps even Bearman, although he knew that Bearman was unpredictable, so he was unsure of that. But he felt like he had found a new freedom, not only in his dreams, but also in himself. It was obvious to him that Cornelia was his new teacher. Chapter 23. Mother. At breakfast that morning, both of his parents were their usual selves, absorbed in their own thoughts and actually not wanting to be disturbed in them. David looked inquisitively at Cornelia. She just rubbed her eyes and asked him to pass the orange juice. Mother served them each an egg, and then she and Father sat down, and they all ate. "I had a strange dream last night," Cornelia announced. "Oh, no," thought David to himself. "She can't tell about our traveling together." He glanced at Mother and Father, but they were busy eating and hardly paid any attention to Cornelia. Then Mother said, "Oh, I had a strange dream last night as well. I was with a little old Indian man, and he made me some tea. What could that possibly mean?" She looked at David and Cornelia, and there was briefly a sense of wonder in her eyes, but it quickly left, and she continued eating absent-mindedly. Cornelia and David glanced at each other. "Mother, was anyone else at tea with you in your dream?" David asked. "I think there was someone else there, but it was kind of fuzzy, and I never do remember my dreams. But there was a special feeling in this one, kind of like a mystery or something. Yes, I think there may have been 1 or 2 other people there, but it was very fuzzy." She didn't look at her children as she said this, and remained focused on her breakfast. David was dying to ask her more about her dream, but he realized she was not wanting to elaborate, nor did she take the dream seriously other than her brief flash of curiosity. "Anyway," she said abruptly, "it's time for me to be on my way to work, and you also, dear," as she turned to Father. David recognized this withdrawal. It was such a standard part of her repertoire when she didn't want to explore more deeply. She was safe on the surface in her own cage. David could almost see a "do not disturb" sign hung around her neck. The cage was a safe place, even though she had constructed it herself. Chapter 24. Dreaming Mother? Cornelia and David just sat and stared at each other after Mother and Father had left for work. "Did you?" "No, yes." "What?" Both were trying to speak at the same time. Then they both just laughed. "Did you see Mother at the meeting with Grandfather?" David asked. He realized he was too surprised at Mother's dream to even ask what he had intended to, whether Cornelia had taken him to Grandfather's. "No, I thought it was just you and me with Grandfather," Cornelia answered. "How did she get there? Or maybe it wasn't really Grandfather, but just a dream she had on her own." "But it did sound like Grandfather. And did you take me there, or did I take you?" "I don't know. Could it be that Grandfather just called us both? Did he pull us there, or did we go?" Neither Cornelia nor David seemed to know what had really happened, but they both felt that they could ask Grandfather, and that he would know the answers. Finally, David said, "I thought you had taken me there." "No, it wasn't my doing," Cornelia replied. "Could it be that we each just went independently and met there?" "I suppose it's possible. But what is this about Mother? Is she visiting with Grandfather as well? Should we talk to her more about her dream?" "I think she was a bit afraid of talking about it more. But perhaps that was just because Father was present. You know, he does have a dampening effect on Mother's communication. She's much more open with me when he isn't around. When he's present, she always acts as if she's afraid he will criticize her." "Yes, I remember that about them.